You're listening to Voices of Your Village. This is episode 140. In today's episode, I got to interview Dr. Neal Lester. He's a professor of English at Arizona State University, and he studies African American literature and culture, including things like literature as we know it, as he stated here, children's literature, race relations, bias, and cultural appropriation. I wanted to dive into conversation with Dr. Lester about cultural appropriation versus appreciation. This was a topic I personally had a lot of questions on, and that our village was asking a lot about, especially as we're moving into holiday season and things like Halloween or Thanksgiving, etc. And this is a topic that I think we could all really be diving into in our day-to-day life. Dr. Lester brought up so many crucial, important things for us to consider and to be mindful of in our everyday life. It's an ongoing process. This isn't something where you're going to have a conversation with a kid and it's going to be done and over with. This is something that's ongoing conversation. I learned a lot from this conversation and am really jazzed to bring it to you today. So let's dive in. Here's our conversation with Dr. Lester. Welcome to Voices of Your Village, a place where parents, caregivers, teachers, and experts come to support one another on this wild ride of raising tiny humans. We combine decades of experience with the latest research to create the modern parenting village. Let's dive into honest conversation about real parenting challenges so it doesn't have to be this hard. I'm your host, sleep consultant, child development specialist, and passionate feminist, Alyssa Blass Campbell. Hey everybody, welcome back to Voices of Your Village. Today I get to hang out with Dr. Neal Lester. Hello, Dr. Lester. How are you?
Hello, I'm good. Thank you. And yourself?
Doing pretty well this afternoon.
Good.
Thanks for joining us today. Can you share with our village a bit about who you are and your background, kind of what brings you here?
Well, I'm a professor of English here at Arizona State University. I just marked my 23rd year. And I study African American literature and culture, from literature as we know it to children's literature, pop culture, race relations, privilege and bias, cultural appropriation. And I've been doing that for about 30 years and always looking at literature as one lens through which we can read culture more broadly.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think that's huge. We have a certification program for child care centers, and one of the things that we incorporated was a box of books for these schools to have access to diversifying their bookshelves. I think it's so important. And it starts so young.
It does, and that's interesting because I've been one of few that I've come across who do both the African American literature, but also the children's literature. And often people can do either or, but I've always integrated children's text into my teaching of adult stuff. So whether it's toys and things like I have here, these are toys, but they're actually bigger than toys. Puzzles, dolls, all of those things become text and material culture through which we can read a whole lot of stuff. And children's books are certainly one of those things.
I love that. I'm so excited to learn from you today. So we had reached out to our village and asked what they wanted to learn more about. And one of the topics that came up was cultural appropriation, and really trying to understand for folks, what does this look like and what is kind of the difference here between appreciation and appropriation, and how do we find that out? What does that look like for us as adults in order to be able to show up for the tiny humans and teach this?
Well, it's interesting because often when this conversation starts, it's most often after something has happened. Somebody has gone to a Halloween party and they've worn blackface, and they're suddenly surprised that while they were at the party, everybody was like, oh my gosh, how cool is that? How edgy is that? That's awesome. And then they go to post it on social media, and you recognize that that's not a thing to do. And the social consequences are not fatal, but they can certainly be detrimental to one's social capital. And that's anyone from adults who are doing it as sort of a social thing versus those folks who are now in political office, and those pictures out there in yearbooks tend not to go away. So I think in many ways, it's not that complicated as people make it. There are various ways in which it manifests itself, but let's say the most obvious way I'll say is when one takes a culture that is not one's own and one performs that. What that means is that you dress up as that in a most literal way. Performance could also be where one sounds like. So that's when a lot of white people get into problem when they decide that they're going to start rapping. And they don't rap as themselves, they rap as some performance of something they have seen because it's cool and it's edgy. And it's typically white people doing it, but I also know that people of color can also appropriate, whether it's not, not necessarily in the same way and where the same power dynamics play out. So here it is most simply, I think, is the way in which someone has taken something from someone else, stolen it, and they get credit for it. It's a kind of plagiarizing where the people who created it are not necessarily the people who are benefiting from its labor. Somebody else is doing it. And so putting on blackface would be cool for white people, but Black people who wear black all the time, living is not easy, as this summertime has shown us. So there's a disconnect between the sort of performing of that and putting it on because it's cute or it's cool, or saying yas, all those ways in which language becomes that, and then we credit that to Lady Gaga and queer folks, when in fact my history shows that yas actually comes from Black women in those Black churches who were offering that as a kind of affirmation of what was going on in that kind of call and response. So there's a way in which one knows the history, then one can then self-censor what you're going to perform. And that's how the indigenous mascots come up. Why are we alleging that these mascots that we just got rid of after all these years this summer were somehow paying homage to Indians, when many are saying it is not? It is an insult. It is ridiculous. So the appreciation can come when I want to listen to rap music, but then I don't necessarily feel compelled to have to do it or perform it. So it is about the performative part of that.
Yeah, that makes total sense. I think that's a clear, cut line for us as well. I heard you mention the power dynamics and
yes,
looking at dominant culture and the role that
yes,
plays in cultural appropriation.
yes,
yes. I think this is something white people really need to hear.
Yes. Well, here's an example, because it goes on so many directions. And it's even happening now to some extent in how we are approaching racial justice work. So, there are white people whose names we would recognize instantly in terms of books that you should go read right now. And it doesn't mean that those folks are not capable and intellectually able to deliver that. The problem comes because these white people who are these experts are not experts in the lived experience, yet they are the ones who are topping the New York Times list. And white people would rather hear that from white people than from someone who looks like me, whose lived experience certainly matches what somebody else is writing about from some other perspective. So the other part of that, though, is, I have to be transparent and honest, is that when I received your invitation, then just the naming of your program kind of, it was a little odd because this notion of village, as I know it, comes from sort of African roots. And so, I wanted to know, well, who is this group, and does this group look like me? And is that in and of itself a kind of appropriation of an idea in the same way that we would say we want to bring my tribe in. Well, I understand that that's very specific to a group of people. For us to sort of do that linguistically sort of potentially has us sort of being complicit in that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's huge to note. And when we started Seed, every single email was signed off from this, one of my favorite books. It's called It Takes a Village, and it's about this African village
Yep.
and this child who's cared for throughout the
Yep.
day within the village. And there was a quote from that was pulled from that book that was in every email signature and whatever, and really fed into the Voices of Your Village naming and this concept of the village. And that resonated with me. And I feel like I grew up in a small town that had that village feel too, where
Right.
everybody pitched in and took care of each other.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, it certainly extends to others. It's the naming of it that can potential signal, particularly when, and I don't know this, but I just wonder what the demographics of your group be. And I say that because my initiative is doing stuff on parenting, and we've had problems actually finding parents of color and experts of color to talk about parenting. So even this realm of parenting has been mostly white females doing that. And so that's it doesn't say anything about parents of color are not out there. It's just that the parents of color don't always have the luxury of doing what we're doing now, which is sitting back and being able to think about this and write about it and become the experts. And I'm having a conversation right this moment about issues of diversity, where we also talk about diversity of representation. So, that wouldn't even come up. And that's what's tricky about this when we start talking about race relations, because I don't believe that all of these performances come from some place that is evil or vile. I think people don't often know the histories of this. I knew once I studied, the history of that NFL team, and I knew what that word meant, then I knew that I was not going to use it, and that I was going to call attention to it by calling it out whenever I saw it. And so that's what I'm saying, is that it's tricky. But then there are more obvious cases when you talk about Elvis Presley, for example, and the ways in which Elvis Presley's popularity was based on cultural appropriation. And it's an interesting twist that I heard on another show, that Elvis's hair, there's sort of this double appropriation, where Elvis's hair actually comes from Black people he saw at the time, Black men who slicked their hair back. Well, the Black men had slicked their hair back because they saw the white people's hair being slicker. So it's like this double layer. And notice Elvis' popularity as the king. And there are some folks out there who were his peers saying, but wait a minute, Elvis was only doing what the Black people were doing, but somehow the white people were more comfortable seeing him do it than seeing, someone else do it. And the same thing for Pat Boone and Little Richard, or, Robin Thicke and Marvin Gaye. So there's a way in which white people prefer to be around and can create a space where they can stay insulated and just be with white people. I don't know that can be said of other groups in this country. There are certainly segregated spaces, but I don't know if there's segregated spaces where Black and brown people don't have to come in contact with someone who is not Black, particularly when we start talking about those people in positions of power, those people who are the managers, those people who are on the Supreme Court, those people who are your supervisors. That's what we're talking about.
Yeah, no, for sure. And that's interesting to think about how white people can kind of be in their pockets and not have to interact outside of that.
Ever.
Yeah.
In any meaningful way. I mean, you may have somebody who does your landscape or somebody who cleans your house, but you don't have to go to somebody, ask for permission to be off because you need, childcare, or, during this pandemic, there are lots of parents who don't necessarily have the option of childcare. And so the person you are most likely to go to, and I'm not talking about those exceptions, I'm talking about the people you are most likely. And then I would add to that, we can't just say that as a blanket statement about white people. We can also say that that's also gendered, that the likelihood is that those folks are white men who may not understand, a single mom's need to have this sort of accommodation. So yeah, that's what I'm saying. When we're talking about cultural appropriation, we're talking about people who have the power to take something and then get credit for it. Because you could also go back to the story that we've heard something about Jack Daniels, for example, and the fact that an enslaved person actually came up with that recipe for Jack Daniels, but never benefited from that because the owner actually got credit for that. Or we could look at the story of Betty Boop and know that Betty Boop was this Black woman during the 1920s, and this white woman saw her doing this act and just took the act on, and that's the Betty Boop that we know. So this appropriation is everywhere in music. I mean, the most obvious is, Iggy Azalea, and when I first heard that, I was like, wow, that's some new artist on the scene. And then I thought, okay, some of these words feel really exaggerated and very minstrel-like. That minstrel tradition where white people dressed up, one of the earliest appropriations, allegedly as some enslaved Black person that had been seen and danced around on the stage in these sort of coonish and buffoonish ways for the entertainment of other white people. So therein lies the thread here. And then the sort of twisted part about that is that you hear Iggy Azalea, and that's really not how she talks. She does not sing as she talks. Whereas Adele, for example, sings as she talks. Pitbull sings as he talks. So that is a kind of performance. So people have attached Iggy Azalea to this Black scent. That's what I mean about the performance part. And I can't tell you how many commercials are out there, whether it's a Toyota commercial for Sienna van or, my jammies that this nuclear, typical all-American family, I want to say in North Carolina, that do these very clever videos, but they appropriate. There's one even on, talking about your OCD. Well, we don't know if they actually have OCD, but that's another appropriation when we start talking about, oh, my OCD, when we use ableist language. So appropriation is really more complicated. And I'm not talking about stuff like food, like, oh, if I eat a burrito, am I appropriate? That's not what I'm talking about. I am talking about the dressing up as a costume and having no awareness of the history of that, and sort of doing it because it's edgy or it's cool.
Yeah, and as you're sharing that, I was thinking of this part from Layla Saad's book, Me and White Supremacy, where she was talking about how within cultural appropriation is that the dominant culture gets to benefit in some way from the culture of the non-dominant culture, part of it that they had not gotten to benefit from, that they don't get to take off, that
Absolutely.
Right? And trying that on, that's what kind of came up for me there.
Well, and it's interesting also because now, at least in the circle that I'm witnessing, there's a lot of conversation about capitalism now and actually benefiting from this. And that if we talk about racism as its companion, as many are saying now, to capitalism, then we can see that those who benefit most from it are the ones who are less likely to give it up or to dismantle it. And that's one of the things, is that the laborers do the labor, but the people who benefited from it are the ones at the bottom. And that's what cultural appropriation is. Cultural appropriation is the way in which language is sort of appropriated. It's cool now, for white people to say the N-word with the A on it because they've heard somebody else say it, so they feel like they can say it. And, in another conversation, we could talk about that, because I personally don't subscribe to any use of it that's not historically accurate. And so this social way that it's used does not in any way suggest that anybody has appropriated or reclaimed anything when it was never ours to begin with. But to get back specifically with the cultural appropriation, sometimes people want to get into the weeds and start talking about foods. Now, the way I see it, if somebody's going to open a Chinese restaurant and they have no connection to that culture, except they are using it to benefit, then that's a problem. The same thing with people who claim they're doing soul food, but you can tell nobody in that kitchen has touched any soul food. Now, I also recognize that cultures blend. So if you're talking about Black and Southern, with somebody like Paula Deen, then you can see how those. But so much of what we know as white culture of the South has actually been influenced by Black folks. And so much of what we know about music today has been influenced by Black folks. But Black folks aren't the one who have most benefited. And when I'm talking about benefited, I'm not just talking about getting paid. I'm talking about the whole thing that goes with, the fact that white people don't have to be an entertainer or an athlete to be successful. The Black people do. So there's a power dynamic. And I don't want to leave this conversation somehow suggesting that it's only white people who can appropriate. Black people, brown people do it too. I've seen Beyonce, do something that was Orientalism in her videos. I've also seen her with Destiny's Child doing something that was Native American, because that's real popular. Costuming now is the second honest. All of those things become appropriate, but even in that context, Beyonce is the one that has the money. So she is the one that has the power in that context. But when we talk about this more broadly, socially, this has become racialized and gendered, because too many conversations don't recognize that this popularity we have of men dressing up as women as funny really speaks to the ways in which misogyny and sexism. It's funny when a man dresses up as a woman because it's usually to entertain. I'm thinking Flip Wilson, Patrick Swayze, Robin Williams, Tyler Perry, Jamie Foxx. It's all done at the expense of women. And that is not the same as I don't read it as the same as when we see something like RuPaul's Drag Race, which is really about an artful kind of storytelling about femininity, however feminized it is.
Yeah, there was a really good documentary that I watched about transgender folks in film and television that was on Netflix recently that talked about that specifically. And
oh, really? What's the name of it?
I don't remember now. I feel like I'm going to look this up. Hang on, if you want to mention it.
Because, and that's what comes out when we start talking about, who's going to play the role.
Yes.
The person whose name I can't remember now was going to place a transgender character. And people were like, well, why aren't you trying to get a transgender character to play that? And people say, well, that's what acting is. Well, that's true. But what about the opportunities for those who are transgender versus those who are cisgender? So start looking at that. And then and her name is like this close, Scarlett Johansson.
Oh.
Was going to play a transgender character and got a whole bunch of stuff. And look at the roles that are available for transgender people whose story is not transgender necessarily. That's what I say.
I'm sorry.
There's appropriation of old people. I noticed that, when we talk about those systems of oppression, ageism is one of those things that still becomes funny for folks. Live used to do it all the time. If you're going to be old, you have to have white hair and you have to hobble on a cane. And then and then some of the seniors in high schools, when they graduate, they have senior day. So they dress up as old people. And, I love doing this. I won't do it this year, but in the past, every Halloween, I would go to the spirit store and I would just look at what new costumes were there that feed into this cultural appropriation. So there's Nicki Minaj, and you got to have big pillows in your bottom. And while it's not blackface, it's still appropriating an identity that is not yours and somehow benefiting from it, whether it's monetarily or social capital, because it makes you funny and it gets a laugh.
Yeah, for sure. That Netflix doc was Disclosure, and
every
human in it is a transhuman. And yeah, it was so good. But I think Halloween, let's chat. So I think that's where a lot of parents, right now coming into the fall are like, that's next on the horizon. Although who knows what Halloween looks like in COVID life, but nonetheless, like, how can we best support folks also within early childhood classrooms of really diving into culture and appreciating it and discussing it and sharing it and celebrating it without appropriating it?
Right. Well, you can certainly appreciate it without having to dramatize it or perform it. And I say, what's interesting about this to me is that there are all these costumes out there. And I keep saying Halloween should be an opportunity for adults and for the children to come up with something that's more creative. Colin Kaepernick as a white person is not particularly creative. In fact, it gets you in a lot of trouble. Dressing up as a sexy Pocahontas, that's not creative. Something that's more creative. Dress up as a pineapple, or dress up as a, just something. Think outside the box. That's what it shows, is a lack of creativity and imagination. So it's a simple test. Just because Disney puts it out doesn't mean it's something that people should do automatically, because Disney has lots of problems with race and gender. And Disney has never been particularly conscious in addressing those in a very overt way. And we know the history of Disney that came from that sort of minstrel tradition. That's why these mice have white faces. That's why we would see Dumbo, for example, and those crows would be minstrel characters where they're just goofing and jiving and laughing and nothing, that was of any substance except for the purpose of entertainment. Anything that has to do with changing one's skin color, or painting so that you are painting your skin red or painting your skin black, should be a sign there. You can be Princess Jasmine, for example, as a little white girl and just have the costume. When you start putting on wigs, and I'm thinking of Afro wigs, because if we're going to do something in the 60s, parents, we feel like we have to have an Afro. And I'm not talking about what people would call a Jewfro, because I have heard that term in my research on hair and putting that in quotes. But we're talking about an Afro that was very popular during the 60s and 70s. That should be a sign, because that's not yours. And people own these experiences. And, sometimes people get bogged down saying, well, how can you own that experience? Well, we can look at how people are treated in this country and know that these are not things that people can take off if it's parts of their identity. I think it was one of the Ohio universities that has a campaign called My Culture is Not a Costume. So look it up. If a parent has a question about it, that's the first sign. Now, you can also surround yourself with people who will hold you accountable. But I would hope it would not just be about costumes. It would be about other things that we say and things that we think, because we surround ourselves most often with people who think like us, have the same values. So somewhere in that group, we hope there'll be somebody that will challenge that. The other part is to step outside of our insulated social circles and talk to other people. Most of us don't have people who don't look like us in our circles. So that could be the first step. And that could also model for what you call tiny people or tiny humans, that diversity really matters. And it's not something that we're just rhetorically giving lip service to. So there are all kinds of ways in which there's no sort of, let's check this and check. If you've got a question about it, if you've got people around you who will call you on that stuff, and that helps us be better, and it helps us to do better.
Yeah. And I think some of it is stuff that I know personally, like I hadn't even thought of or called into question. And just the other day, we were looking at setting up this new nursery for this baby and whatever. And we're looking at just inspo ideas, and saw a kid teepee. And I love a cozy corner that you can hide away in and have space in. But I was like, ooh, that feels like cultural appropriation. First of all, I don't know the history on teepees, so I would have to do a little more research there. Know that it's, from indigenous folks, but don't know much more, so have to do more research. But also, if you're buying a teepee from Target, then the person who's profiting from that teepee, that's a problem, right? So I think so many of these things come into our everyday life that we might not even acknowledge or call into question, right? We were gifted some clothes, and there were these really adorable moccasin shoes. And I was like, oh my gosh, these are so cute. And then I was like, let's look up this brand and make sure that whoever's profiting from this, that's indigenous to that culture, right?
Right.
And I think within, I think especially with social media, and there's so much that's shareable, there's this picturesque, whatever thing that can happen through Instagram and Pinterest and whatever, both in classrooms and in homes, that there's so much that is, that we're not questioning,
Well, and that's the whole sense, I think, of this sort of waking up that many white people are doing to racial justice. I mean, corporations are doing it with these statements that are coming out. And I would be willing to guess that 90%, if not 100% of those folks coming out with corporate statements probably have a diversity statement someplace. My question is, why isn't that diversity statement your social justice statement? Because that's what diversity should be always connected to. So that's what I'm saying is, where have people been? And yes, I'm grateful that people are waking up from a slumber, but there are people who've been living these experiences of watching people appropriate that language, or appropriate that costume, or appropriate an experience that is not a lived experience, that profits equally from the people taking it. So that's what I think. The appreciation is, I can appreciate a whole lot of things without feeling like I have to perform it. Mm-hmm. I don't, and what I mean by that is trying to sound like it. I don't mean karaoke, because karaoke is a different kind of experience. But if in fact we're going to make a whole lot of money singing this song, Iggy Azalea, and then I see you on Jimmy Kimmel, and that's not even how you sound, then that just adds to that performative, quality. And then there's that one Toyota Sienna van. I think it's called, oh gosh, I can't remember. It's a van commercial, and it's got the four white people. There's always the heteronormative mom and dad and two kids, and Swagger Wagon. That's what it's called. And they are talking about how they want to make this van cool, but they start sort of performing with the posturing and the arms and the lips poked out, and the whole performance of that, they go back in and out of their Black performance, gangster, and their white performance. And you can see those at play. And, there are commercials for Ruby Tuesdays where this, again, a mom, white dad, two kids, I think it's one kid there, they're at a salad bar, and she just starts rapping, just randomly rapping, because there's a new salad bar at Ruby Tuesdays. And the white dad is sort of looking at her like she's really odd. But what makes it cute, though, is when white people, and I've seen this in performances of choruses, there's a very fancy chorus around here from a rich neighborhood, and they were doing the whipping nay-nay. So they had the fancy clothes on, and they were whipping and nay-nay, and the primarily white audience just was raving about that. Then I ask you, well, if there were Black kids doing whipping nay-nay, would it be raving about that? And the answer is no. It wouldn't be cute. Somebody would probably describe it as ghetto. But because it disconnects from the reality, then we can be entertained by it, and then leave that performance, and then go back into our comfortable whiteness that can be separated. And if the Black people and the stereotypes can't always be separated. So the fact that I have, degrees, published, done all that, can't be separated for some people when I'm walking down the street. That's what I'm.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And so for parents who are like walking into this space, you said like the Disneys of the world, like just because it's out there doesn't mean you need to buy into it. I am curious, like, Moana just came up for me in my thought process of like, if you have a tiny human who's loving Moana and now wants to like be this character for Halloween, or is really into, what are some guidelines and support for parents and caregivers, teachers, to dive deeper into the history around this and teaching kids without appropriating culture on that journey?
Well, first of all, you've got to do exactly what you just said, as I sort of stopped for a moment and said, is there a problem here with those moccasins and the teepee? So I think in order for us to sort of move the needle, we all have to be more thoughtful critically. And that's not always a first place that people go to, because we live in very fast-paced, we need to get it done, we don't have time to think. But it really is sad to me, we don't have time to think about anything, and we're only relying on these sort of quick snippets of things for some immediate gratification. So I would say that because I'm a teacher, and I'm hoping that people, when they're reading literature, will go beneath the surface. But I know that that's an ideal and not always a real. So you got to pause and think that, but you also need to be aware of what's happening in the world. We can't exist in a bubble and then expect people to care about what's happening. And that's what I fear in terms of the racial justice stuff. The stuff that people are talking about since George Floyd wasn't stuff that just sort of happened this summer. And so there's got to be some awareness of why isn't that you haven't paid attention to that? Why isn't that you haven't been engaged in the conversation about the mascots? And what are you doing now that somehow makes your focus different? And that's the same thing with costumes. I mean, if you're thinking about a costume, first of all, do a little bit of research on it. Don't just do it because people like it. Disney will sell Pocahontas costumes, but Pocahontas is a fiction, and Pocahontas does detriment to the history of the real Pocahontas. So that's the responsibility of the adult in the room. And if the adult's participating in that, then it means that you're modeling something that you may not even be aware that you're modeling. So if everybody's going to dress up, and as I said, when I gave those examples of the white families, the white heteronormative family, there were 2 kids there watching that and participating in the performance. So there's got to be a lot of self-reflection. And I boil all of these conversations down to something that my particular initiative here at Project Humanities calls Humanity 101. Is there any possibility costume could be denying some group or some individual their humanity? And what we mean by that is not some kind of, faith-based, but integrity, respect, kindness, compassion, empathy, forgiveness, and self-reflection. To sort of filter whatever that decision is through that. Am I being respectful? And we can't just dismiss this as you don't know what you don't know, because there are lots of things that we should know. We should know this. If we are adults living in this society, we should know that everybody's not treated equally. Know that whether it's old people or women or people who are differently abled or people who don't understand English or people who can't read and write or people who use sign language, there are all kinds of lessons about difference that you don't have to go find if you just open your eyes. And once you see these, you can't unsee them. Your behavior then becomes because you don't care, or you're trying to challenge those to make some point. So that's not a simple prescription, because what I'm actually trying to get people to do is to sort of be better and just do better. And you don't have to, if you have any question about it, then that's probably your first sign that you probably shouldn't do it. I can tell you, and I speak for myself too, I have this shirt that I really, really like, and I wore it in the office, and somebody who is Latina said, that's interesting because that's one of those Mexican ceremony shirts. It's worn on special occasion. I was like, oh, okay. So now when I look at that shirt, I don't know that I want to wear it, because I did do some research and see that. And, I think of the same things when I saw those Congress folks, kneeling with these kente cloths on. The kente cloths mean something ritualistically. Just don't put those on to go do a photo op kneeling. So that's what I'm saying, is this is at so many levels. Folks participate in it too. I mean, I see all the Black people who, decide that they're going to somehow put on all these African garbs when they want to sort of connect with their roots. And I'm thinking of a play called A Raisin in the Sun by Lorraine Hansberry from 1959, where there's a character whose name is Beneatha, decides that she wants to know about Africa. So she has a friend from Africa, Assegai, who's a suitor. And she says, tell me about Africa. And part of her, learning about Africa or asking him about Africa is that it's as though she can get it in kind of a quick, here's 5 minutes about Africa. And she puts on a dashiki and then has an afro, and that to her is Africa. So Africa is bigger than that. Africa is also not a monolith any more than any other continent is. So that's what I'm saying, is that Black people can participate and do participate. In fact, there's an interesting twist to this, because not only did white people blacken their faces, mostly men, and entertain other white people, but then in order to be on the stage, then Black people, like Bert Williams, for example, blackened his own face. So there was like this double edge of appropriation in order to be successful for primarily white audiences.
Yeah.
So, I still say modern day minstrels are people like Kevin Hart, people like Steve Harvey, who are always out there because they're there to give a laugh. And mainstream America is rewarding them, but they're appropriating an image and a stereotype that has not benefited Black people. In fact, it's held people down and actually led to the deaths of people. So it's way more complicated than just buying a Halloween costume if you stop and think about it. And that to me is sort of part of what our living is being able to think about stuff. And it saddens me that we don't have enough time. I don't mean you have to think every single time you get in a car, every time you go out of the house. But on some level, when we're making decisions about this, particularly as they involve people around us, then we at least need to be aware that people are watching.
Yeah, for sure. The tiny humans are always watching.
And
Always.
the grown-ups are always watching too.
It's true.
Yes. So that was a very long-winded response, but part of that is to show that this is far more complicated than Elvis and far more complicated than Pat Boone and Iggy Azalea, that it's sort of everywhere. That's why I wanted to make sure that we talked about dressing up as women. That's funny. We have whole movies about that. And it's different in the sense of a woman who dresses up as a man, because there's a power dynamic between men in this country and women in this country. And it is rarely funny when women dress up as men, because in those cases, often it's because they're trying to access something that men have, whether it's power or position. That's not the case when men are dressing up as women.
Right.
Power there. And I'm not talking about the drag world. I'm talking about this sort of laugh, Flip Wilson stuff that's supposed to be funny.
Yeah, no, I think that was an important thing to note. The power dynamic always coming back into play.
Yep.
Yeah. Oh, thank you so much. Thanks for sharing yourself with us. I'm just sitting in here like wheels turning, and I hope that other folks are too, our teachers that are tuning in, as well as parents, just really reflecting on just intention in terms of like what and impact, right? Like this both of these of like, yeah, your kid really likes this, or the kids are really into this in the classroom. We've heard this from teachers before, that write emergent curriculum in early childhood. It's like, well, our kids are really into this. Great, let's dive deeper into it. Like
let's do some research on it, and then shift. Explain why. Here's a problem. We just don't want to do this. There are ways in which we can come up with so many other creative ideas. And if we're going with a Disney character, just imagine that. How many times do you want to see 6 Pocahontases at the same time? So think outside that proverbial box. Really use Halloween as an opportunity to be really creative.
Totally. And kids are really good at it if we let them.
Absolutely. And again, I think the problem, and I go back to Madonna that I use in a different context. She says, all you need is your own imagination. So use it. That's what it's for. And that's actually much harder than people think, because too often we can't imagine what we haven't experienced. And if you can't imagine it, then it is likely that you can't experience it.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Yes.
Dr. Lester, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you for inviting me and for reaching out. And I'd love to be able to share what you're doing with people in my circles. So let me know when, and if there are any questions that come, I'll be happy to try to revisit this.
Oh, awesome. Thank you so much. I will absolutely keep you posted.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
In this episode, Dr. Lester brought up the cultural appropriation of Voices of Your Village, and I interviewed him about a month before this is airing, and so we spent some time really diving into what's the history of the village and how does this show up culturally, what's the origin of this concept, and how does it show up around the world today. We absolutely should have acknowledged the root of Voices of Your Village in our very first episode. In 2016, NPR researched the origins of the proverb, "It takes a village," and was unable to pinpoint them. although academics said that the proverb is originally embodying African culture. There are a few different examples that show up of proverbs that translate to "it takes a village" or something related to that within African cultures. Some that translate to "a child does not grow up only in a single home," or "a child belongs not to one parent or home." Another meaning, regardless of a child's biological parents, its upbringing belongs to the community. In Swahili, there is a saying or a proverb that translates to "whomsoever is not taught by the mother will be taught with the world." There are many different cultures within Africa that really hold the root of this proverb, "it takes a village." And so I want to acknowledge that, and that this is not something that is new by any means, and it is something that we have seen around the world in many different facets. Many folks who live intergenerationally and have multiple generations living under one roof to help care for children, multiple cultures and villages where the entire village really does step in to take care of the raising the tiny humans and supporting parents on this journey and supporting each other. And this is something that we talk about a lot here in America. And somebody had reached out and said, where is this village people speak of? And the reality is that culturally, in the US right now, we often pay for our village. Most folks are not raising their children in a village in the traditional African sense of everyone really participating and showing up to support one another with food, with childcare support, with wherever this looks like across the board. And for us, often we're paying for childcare, or we might be paying for a meal service instead of coming together to combine meals and maybe even grocery shop together. I'm going to the farmer's market on Saturday and I'll pick up all of our groceries between these three families this week, or things like that, that here in the States, I feel like we're really lacking. And when I was growing up, I grew up in a really small town in Western New York. And my grandparents were 5 houses down, and it was very much a town where I could pop over to a friend's house and grab corn for our dinner, or go over to Allie Ty's farm and get eggs. I felt like there was more of that traditional African village culture in the space I grew up in, where people were really caring for each other and for each other's kids and all that jazz. And I believe that this is crucial to raising children, and that we have a lot to learn from African cultures about how to do this and what this looks like. To be in community with one another, rather than here's a play date from 1 to 3. And I want to honor the roots of this and really turn to different cultures in Africa to dive into this. And I'm really interested to do more research and to learn more about ways that these structures of raising kids in a village can translate here to the States or wherever you're tuning in from around the world, so that we can all feel more supported on this journey. I don't believe that children are meant to be raised in isolation and solo. I think that it is exhausting as parents to do so. So I appreciate Dr. Lester bringing this up and bringing it to my attention. And I encourage you, there's a book that is by Jane Cohen Fletcher. It's in our book list. We have an Instagram TV and a video in our Facebook group that goes through our book list. And it's called It Takes a Village. And it is about a little boy in an African village and him navigating throughout the day, being cared for and supported by all these other humans in his village. And I think it's a beautiful depiction of this. I think it highlights and honors an African culture in these roots. So thank you, Dr. Lester, for bringing this up, and I'm jazzed to continue to learn.
Thanks for tuning in to Voices of Your Village. Check out the show notes for this episode and all past episodes at voicesofyourvillage.com. Did you know that we have a special community for all of you to be a part of so that we can all gather together to raise emotionally intelligent humans? Head on over to Facebook, search Seed and Sow: Voices of Your Village, and dive into that Facebook group. We cannot wait to hang out with you and collaborate on raising these tiny humans. If you're digging this podcast, head on over to Apple Podcasts, scroll down, click those stars, and leave a review. It really fills my heart to hear from all of you.